But for the betrayed spouse who's committed to the marriage, looking to make it work, and they're trying to relearn, how do I re-engage in healthy sexuality, retrain my brain for healthy sex when maybe it's been a spot for a lot of wounding or fear or whatever. What suggestions would we make for them? What does it look like for the betrayed spouse to rewire their brain?
Yeah, so this is also a great question because the betrayed partner, their brain it'll look different for them because their brain, since disclosure, discovery, they basically have an alarm that's going off in their brain. And some areas of their brain, like in their limbic system and cingulate gyrus, those become really hypoactive or hyperactive because they're afraid. Right? Because something in their environment has caused them to feel unsafe and their brain is reacting to that because that's how God created our brain, right? And then there's other areas of their brain that really are inactive. So like their prefrontal cortex, some of these other areas that we rely on for decision making and other things, that those kind of fall offline. And so there's really a lot of dysfunction, let's call it dysfunction, and chaos happening in a partner's brain. And so for her to get to a place, I'm going to say her, I'm sorry, that was just out of habit, but okay. So for her to get to a place where she wants to re-engage in sex, then she has to feel safe in the relationship, which is going to take time, right? Because her world has been rocked in a way that she never thought would happen, that she never could have imagined. And her brain is basically reacting to now the stress and threat that she's perceiving in her environment. And so really for her, it's going to take time, but then also, like we've talked about, for her to see her spouse doing the work that is going to rebuild trust, like using the tools and changing some of their patterns, those kind of things are definitely going to help with that. And sometimes it takes a trained counselor to work with a couple to when they get to the point that they want to re-engage in sex, because it's kind of a scary deal, I think, for a lot of partners, is that, okay, if I am going to re-engage in sex with my spouse and I've been so hurt and my brain is holding on to these feelings, how am I going to feel safe? And so, and they even, counselors will work with them to help them give them practical tools, like have sex with the lights on, have sex only in this position where you're face to face. And so you can see each other. And you know what I mean? All of these things that are really practical and might feel weird at first, but it really is, the point is for both people in the relationship to retrain their brain to respond in a way that is going to be mutually satisfying. And the other piece to this, I was going to mention it earlier, but the other piece to this is that if we know that all of these different chemicals are stimulated through orgasm, and we also know that because of the way that our brain captures information and stores it, that we have to get to a point where we're having sex with our spouse and we're not feeling any shame. We're not feeling guilt. We're not having images of these past things coming up in our brain, which I think can happen for both spouses, and so I think that, again, giving yourself time and space, and also for a partner, communicating well. You know what I mean? To being able to say, when this happens, I feel this way, and which again is going to take time. And if she's going through betrayal and beyond, then she's going to get some of these practical tools. But to be able to say, you know what, it scares me to re-engage in sex with you because I feel this way and I'm afraid of this, and just letting it be a point of conversation, even before you're in the middle of having sex or engaging in sex. And I think that, like I said, counseling for both, for this couple is so important, I think. Yeah,
I wrote the same thing down, voicing wants and needs, and that idea too, that not just during sex, outside of sex, voicing those. And I think that that's one thing we found in Betrayal and Beyond, is that women find their voice and realize that their voice has value and carries weight in their relationship. But I think too, especially I'm thinking through maybe how sex has been pursued or played out in relationships that have pornography or sexual brokenness impacting it, is to create and maintain boundaries and like stand firm by those boundaries. And know that you're not, because I think a lot of the messages we get, maybe sometimes inadvertently, maybe sometimes like straight up from the church is like, you can't deprive your husband. You can't, we're talking specifically from the woman's perspective as the betrayed partner. You can't deprive him or else, that every 72 hour kind of perspective, which we know to not be an actual thing. I think that is just the encouragement, is create boundaries that make sure you feel safe and then maintain them, and don't flex on them, because flexing on them is not a way of loving your spouse. Doing that is just, in some ways you're kind of just rolling over and giving back into the pressures maybe you were experiencing at first. And again, this is not my experience, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I just feel like from my vantage point, that's something I would encourage a betrayed partner to do, is create those boundaries and maintain them.
Yeah. I think we've talked on the podcast that we believe that healthy, mutually satisfying sex is part of a good marriage. Mm-hmm. And so if you're committed, and again, if the marriage is in jeopardy and because of behaviors, you don't know if it's wise or right to make it work, you're in a different scenario. Yeah. But for those that know, I'm committed to this marriage and I want to make it work, then that future hope of mutually satisfying sex together is what you should be looking towards, and not ever just settling for, well, we're just never going to have sex again. It's off the table. Mm-hmm. Because if that's where you're at, I think you do need to ask some questions of, why do I feel that way? And what do we maybe need to face? But at the same time, as I say that, if you're in early recovery, as Heather talked about, those first 90 days might be the first 6 months, and you're not there yet, that's okay. Mm-hmm. You don't need to guilt yourself. You don't need to feel obligation of like, well, he's been an addict, and so I better make sure I'm helping. Even if you're not ready, don't feel safe. Like, actually, research would show that's going to make things worse and a longer process. Mm-hmm. And so I would just echo what you guys have said. Be honest about where you're at. And if you're not ready, say that. Mm-hmm. At the same time, if sexual connection is something you're craving because you find intimacy in it, share that. Be honest and expect your opinion to be valued by your spouse. Mm-hmm. Because that is, I think, a sign of a spouse moving towards health, is that whether you're saying, I need time and space, or I would like to engage more frequently so that we're connecting, that they go, I really respect that, and I want to honor what I'm hearing from you. And if you're not getting that from your spouse, they're not respecting your voice, you're not being heard, I think that reveals some deeper symptomatic things that are maybe right for you to be cautious about re-engaging sexually. And so I think communication is so important, of being honest where you're at and giving yourself time to get to that place where you feel safe and feel ready. And I think for many betrayed spouses too, if they've been in a pattern where sex is really just about their spouse and doing it for them, and they've maybe been ignoring some of their needs where they're even experiencing physical pain or discomfort, it's being able to communicate those things and then do what it takes, if that's visiting a doctor or getting, better forms of lubrication. All the kind of things that can happen. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't have to resign yourself to uncomfortable, painful sex. That's never what we're saying and never what we want you to do. But we do believe there's a lot of things we could move towards that would help address those. So all that, I think, starts with being honest, having our voice in the relationship. And if your spouse is also committed to making the marriage work, I believe they're going to want to hear that and really honor you, because they've realized, boy, in my sex addiction, I've dishonored you. Yeah. And I know for this marriage to work, I'm going to need to be honoring of you. And so what does that look like? And if you don't tell them, they don't know. They don't know if you're wanting more or less, if you're not ready, if you are. So I think just communicate, be honest. And if that's really hard to do, back to what Heather said, that's a great reason to go to a counselor together, to say, we don't even know how to talk about this without an argument or without just shutting down and going into different rooms. But we know we want to. We want to get to where we can just talk as a couple. Would you help us? And that's what certified sex addiction therapists are trained to do, and to help you navigate how to get back to that place as a couple. So all that to say, if you can keep hope in mind that one day we will have mutually satisfying sex together as part of a healthy relationship, but right now that's a pathway that's going to take some time, that's okay. Just keep taking whatever the next step is. And I keep hearing the book, The Great Sex Rescue by Sheila Ray Gregoire, come up in all the comments, like, oh, Sheila addresses that in the book. Oh, Sheila addresses that in the book. Oh, Sheila addresses that. So especially for betrayed spouses, if you haven't read that book, pick it up.
Put it in the show
notes.
And then,
tell your spouse, say, if you love me and want us to have a healthy sex life, I think you should read this book, because I really believe it is paradigm shifting and would be really good for your marriage if you haven't read that yet.